This video is sponsored by Movie Palette.
Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Chris Pine leads a mighty quest in Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. After escaping from prison, Bard Ed Gundavis, played by Chris Pine, and Barbarian Holger Kilgore, played by Michelle Rodriguez, discover that the rogue that betrayed them, Hugh Grant's Forge Fitzwilliam, has installed himself as the Lord of Neverwinter, and is working for Safina, played by Daisy Head, a red wizard with a sinister plan. Edgar and Holger assemble a team, including Justice Smith's sorcerer Simon, and Sophia Lillis' druid shapeshifter Doric, to try and steal the Tablet of Reawakening, which Edgin wants to resurrect his wife, and save Edgin's daughter Kira, played by Chloe Coleman, who is being manipulated by Forge's lies. When it comes to film and TV adaptations, Dungeons & Dragons really hasn't had a lot of luck. Even if we leave aside that time that a very young Tom Hanks completely lost his mind LARPing, the last big budget D&D adaptation was back in 2000, which was pretty much universally panned by everybody, and only notable for the fact that respected actor Jeremy Irons completely hammed it up to infinity as the film's villain. That film was a huge box office bust back in its day, and seemingly no one liked it, but somehow that still managed to produce two sequels, one for television and one straight to DVD, and I believe the fan consensus is that those are slightly better than the big budget movie that they spawned from, but still pretty cheap and literally things that you'd see on the Sci-Fi Channel. 20 years has now passed, and Hasbro wants another bite at the apple, especially because they want to put more of their properties into the film world, having enormous success with the Transformers movies. A few years back, they purchased the company Entertainment One, who actually distributes this new D&D movie in Canada and the UK, although it does now appear that Hasbro is trying to sell that particular company off. This new iteration is written and directed by Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daly, who previously worked on Game Night, which of course is considered to be one of the best comedies come out in the last few years. Really well directed and stylized, unusually so for something that has come out so recently, and definitely takes a lot of cues from Fincher. So they bring their particular angle to this new iteration of D&D, and guess what? They roll a 20. Now, I'm sure the first question you'll ask me is, do I play D&D? And the answer is, no, actually, I don't. I have never played Dungeons & Dragons in my life. A lot of my friends do, so I have a very passing familiarity with it, but for the most part, I'm reviewing this from a very casual perspective. So if you're in the same camp as me, you can be reassured that this is a very accessible movie, and I think that's largely the point. This new film is intended to get people hooked on D&D as a sort of gateway into that world, so obviously they don't want viewers to be overwhelmed by backstory. It doesn't commit the same mistake as something like, say, Warcraft did a few years ago, where it decided, you know what we really need to do with this fantasy property? Focus on the lore, put that front and centre, just have reams and reams of exposition about the world building right up front. Dungeons & Dragons doesn't do that. Now, that's not to say that it completely throws out everything from the game, because it doesn't. It is very much a movie made by people that play D&D, that enjoy D&D, and that's part of the fun of it. The world is definitely absolutely still there, and there is plenty of references to the games for fans to pick up upon, but it's not foregrounded, it's not the plot of the movie. The actual narrative of it, the heist movie element of it, is what is going to gravitate people towards this film. It's a canny move on the filmmaker's part, where the story feels like a campaign that you play in the game, but also easily readable to outsiders, and it doesn't commit the cardinal sin of taking itself too seriously, which is a blessed relief in a post-Game of Thrones world, where everything has to be grim, dark, and serious, with loads of political intrigue. Instead, Dungeons & Dragons proudly blows a raspberry in that line of thinking's face and goes, hey, do you remember when fantasy things used to be fun? and well lit, and that's exactly the tone that a Dungeons & Dragons movie should have, because the game is played among friends, and that loose, slightly anarchic feeling is all over on Among Thieves, especially because obviously the fantasy setting is not tied to any particular historical era, so the characters do speak in quite modern dialogue with a lot of fair self-awareness, and that's because Dungeons & Dragons is silly in some respects, but the movie owns that. It has the humour to actually embrace that simultaneously. So the movie has to walk a very careful tone. It's not an out-and-out spoof like Your Highness, which seemed to just roll its eyes at the entire genre. Instead, how I would best describe Dungeons & Dragons on Among Thieves is that it takes its world seriously enough, but the humour comes out from the characters. The movie embraces the kind of mythology of the Dungeons & Dragons game, and you can see that in the way that so much of the world is created practically, especially when it comes to the creatures within it. There's a lot of actual practical puppetry in the movie in a way which is genuinely surprising to see in a big budget film where almost everything comes out of a computer these days, but because of that, it feels like a real, genuine, tactile world a lot of the time, and that is impressive on a production level, but also it means that the characters are reacting to situations, they're reacting to the environment. It's not making fun of the people for enjoying the games, it's not doing anything like that. All the humour comes out from the characters and their interactions with each other, and that is an important distinction to make. One of the funniest bits in the movie is an extended sequence where they ask questions to corpses in a graveyard, which turns into quite macabre hilarity because they only have 5 questions, and sometimes they don't realise that they're asking questions. But also it's a sequence that kind of reminded me a little bit of a similar sequence in Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy. What Dungeons & Dragons remind me of throughout the entire running time is the very first Guardians of the Galaxy. It does for fantasy films what that movie did for sci-fi. It's really playful with the genre, it has very likeable characters and filled with good humour, but also takes its world and its emotional stakes seriously. And at its heart, they're both about misfit outsiders coming together as a team and working through their individual issues and problems. That means that the movie is a really satisfying good time, especially on a script level. Goldstein and Daly clearly had a lot of belief in their script because I read that they had very little tolerance for improvisation on the set of this movie, which shows that they were confident in their material. They knew that what they had written on the page was funny and they just needed the actors to sell it on the day. They weren't stopping the movie for a riff along to have loads and loads of different punchlines. As freewheeling as the movie seems to be on screen, it actually is very disciplined in its approach. Most of the cast are asked to play along with their established personas. Chris Pine is especially well suited to being a bard. His Edgin is a talker. He thinks that he can chat his way out of virtually every situation. He's witty, he's charming, he's very good with a lute. He's the planner. He comes up with all the harebrained schemes that of course naturally start going wrong, so he has to improvise. Plan A is out of the question, so it's on to plan B, C, D, E, and any other letters of the alphabet he can think of before getting captured. And Pine seems to be having the most fun he's had in a role since the Star Trek movies. His Edgin, while he's enshewed his vow of protecting the people, he's still at his heart a good man, even if he prefers to think of himself as a scoundrel and a thief. But he's not a man of action. That goes on to Michelle Rodriguez's Barbarian. Holger is very much the kind of role that Rodriguez gravitates towards, these kind of action-heavy roles, and she does most of the fighting for Edgin, especially clear in one scene where both characters are about to be executed. Holger is the one that manages to escape, and she has to take out all the guards all by herself because Edgin fails to actually try and cut his ropes on the steps in the way that she did, although that largely really seems to be his way of trying to get out of doing any of the physical work. But she and Pine have a good chemistry with one another, and Rodriguez actually plays the role with a kind of sly wit, especially because Holger, because of her stint in prison, she has a big fondness for potatoes, which ends up being a kind of offbeat running gag. But underneath her tough exterior, Holger does actually have a lot of loyalty and tenderness, which adds a lot of character and dimension to the role, and Rodriguez seizes that. Justice Smith also does good work as the sorcerer Simon. I do have to admit that in previous films, I've sometimes found Smith to be quite grating, particularly in Fallen Kingdom. I think when he pops up in these big budget movies, sometimes directors just ask him to scream at the top of his lungs, which can be quite obnoxious, but here he's actually in fairly subdued form, and also sporting a surprisingly solid English accent. I definitely didn't expect that from him. His character Simon comes from a long line of sorcerers, and yet he feels the weight of that lineage bearing upon him. He has very little confidence in his abilities, despite the fact that he can actually do magic to a high level, but he can't do it consistently. He doesn't have that kind of self-belief in himself, and his character arc is perhaps the most clearly realised throughout the entire movie, and I do think that Smith actually is one of the highlights of the film, and certainly the payoffs to that character were very satisfying for me, because I think that I related to that character, and the movie, I think, wants you to relate to these figures, at least find one that fits your particular personality. Sophia Lillis is also likeable as Druid Doric, who joins the group once she realises they're going up against Forge, because he's been destroying the forest. Alas, out of the core four characters, this is perhaps the weakest written, because the character is largely there for their function to shapeshift, and so in the big CGI set pieces, Doric comes to the forefront. That means that Lillis actually falls off screen for extended periods of time due to the shape-shifting. But when Lillis is around, scenes don't quite make enough use of her. It does seem that in the group scenes that Doric is kind of on the sidelines with only maybe a few lines. That being said, she does have a good chemistry with the rest of the group. I just wish that the character got a bit more central focus. But nevertheless, Lillis does the very best that she can with the material. You're probably asking yourself, what about Regé-Jean Page? He's definitely in this movie. He's the paladin Zenk. He joins the action midway through. He basically guides the characters through the film's second act on a side quest down into the Underdark. They need to get a helmet before they get the tablet. It's a whole thing. The big joke with Zenk as a character is that he's annoyingly perfect. Of course, Page shows up on the screen being a total plate of handsome, and then the character is saintly good, almost ridiculously so. He's a man of peace and wisdom, and not a lot of humour, but when he gets into a fight, he definitely knows how to carry himself. He is almost like a ridiculously overpowered character, you know, the kind that someone has played the game for a long time and kind of got a little bit of an ego about it. That is the core joke at the centre of this character. And Paige and Pine in particular play off of each other very well in this section of the movie. I just kind of wish that the character was actually around a bit more, because of course once that section of the movie ends, Paige pretty much walks out of the film until the very, very end of it. And I can understand why, because obviously, if you have a character like that around, it kind of defeats the other characters in that he pretty much saves their bacon the whole time. And also, if you've got a character that is so overpowered, it takes the tension out of the proceedings. But Paige is so charismatic, even in his relatively limited screen time, that it is a shame that they didn't make more use out of him. Hugh Grant adds to the collection of Weasley villain roles he's been playing of late with the treacherous Forge, and it's rare to see him in a big budget blockbuster movie like this, let alone enjoying himself in one. He plays Forge quite similarly to Phoenix Buchanan in Paddington 2, in that he's an opportunist. He's a con man, so if he sees the advantage in turning on his allies, he'll do so, and that's exactly what Forge does at the beginning of this movie. And now that he's managed to swipe his way into becoming a lord as well. He's just got free reign to live out his most vain and narcissistic tendencies, and Grant is reveling in playing up those traits. Towards the end of the film, there's a great big balloon with Grant's face on it, which is just quite amusing all by itself. But Forge is also a snivelling coward. He knows that he's being used by Sophina as a way of getting herself in power to enact her own scheme, but he's a useful idiot to her. He's really powerless to stop it, so instead he decides that he's just going to keep himself alive long enough to acquire all the greed and wealth his heart desires, and then run away when things turn nasty. And Grant is enjoying playing this feckless hustler. Speaking of Sophina, she's really the big bad of the movie. She's a red wizard that wants to create an army of the undead to take over the land. But out of the two main antagonists, she's by far the less interesting. Daisy-haired daughter of Anthony is given very little screen time and not a lot of dialogue, especially before the third act. I compared this to Guardians of the Galaxy previously. It's very similar to how Lee Pace was used in that. A fairly stock, standard villain with not a lot in the way of distinctive personality, and largely existing as a powerful foe for the heroes to fight up against at the climax of the movie, because obviously they're not going to do a four-man tag battle against Hugh Grant, although let's be honest, Grant walks away with pretty much every scene that he appears in this movie. If you recall Goldstein Day's work on Game Night, you remember there were some quite elaborate comic set pieces, especially with the way the camera was used, often in quite continuous takes. The same is true in Dungeons and Dragons, which immediately makes it identifiable as their work. The movie really comes to life in the big action set pieces, which really shows how inventive their direction is, but also how clear and precise at the same time. Often, big CGI set pieces become quite cluttered and muddled because they're trying to throw too much at the screen, whereas here you can follow exactly what the action is, and the geography is really well staged. This is largely because, again, a lot of the action is in quite long continuous shots, which really works well, especially for the D&D dynamic, because it allows the characters to use their individual abilities and combo and play off of each other. You definitely see this in the Neverdark sequence where they're trying to escape the dragon. There are several other action sequences that also show off their talents, but the big standout is a sequence where Doric sneaks into the castle and then has to evade the guards back out again, shape-shifting constantly. And that's an extremely elaborate, complicated sequence that goes into live action and then back into fully CG animated sections, but all done to look like a continuous camera shot. And it's a really tense, nail-biting sequence that keeps squarely on Doric the entire time, which is why it's so clear, but it's a really confident, well-done spectacle that shows that the directors are embracing the possibilities of this fantasy world. That it's a place where you can expect the unexpected, and certainly the action sequences really capture the imagination and the fun of playing the games. Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves isn't doing anything revolutionary, certainly not on a story level, but it's so damn entertaining. It's a rollicking adventure. The cast are on fine form, there's plenty of good humour and spectacle, and the direction is unusually good for a big budget movie of this type. It's not perfect. I do think that it loses some of its momentum in the middle before finding it again, and I think that some of the characters are a bit thinly drawn, but for the most part, this is a great time at the movies. You want a big popcorn movie? This delivers. I think it will be satisfying to both fans of the game and total newcomers, and certainly Goldstein and Daly deserve another roll at the dice at D&D. You've probably seen this swish thing in the background of the entire video. This is a movie palette. It takes the colour tone of an entire movie and turns it into this artwork. So each of these lines represents a scene or sequences from the entire movie. In this case, this is Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And if you would like a movie palette of your own, then you can go to moviepalette.com and use the code FILMBRAIN15 to get 15% off your order. And thanks again to Movie Palette for sponsoring this video. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page or a YouTube Super Thanks feature, which is right below below the video, or you can buy some of my merch from my TeePublic page, or you can cast a spell over at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.